Elise Sarotte's Not One Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. If one reads the title of this book, one might assume that the sole purpose of the book was to discuss how Washington, or more specifically James Baker, abandoned his promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. After all, it is the title of the book and a noteworthy subject when discussing Russian-NATO relations. This assumption is not false. Sarotte demonstrates that our best information on the exchanges between Secretary of State James Baker and Gorbachev tell us that a ban on eastward NATO expansion was indeed part of the verbal agreement. While there is no formal documentation stating such, and skeptics have often tried to suggest that this agreement only applied to East Germany, Sarotte does a sufficient job explaining that NATO expansion into other Eastern European countries was indeed part of the agreement. As a Ukrainian advocate, this is not a convenient truth for me. However, as a historian, Elise Sarotte does not leave me disappointed. While in the beginning of the book, Sarotte makes the case that NATO expansion was a topic of importance for Gorbachev and James Baker, she also goes on to tell the story of when, how, and why other countries joined NATO. She discusses in detail the concerns of both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. She mentions that those in U.S. politics who were in favor of NATO expansion and those who opposed NATO expansion. While one may agree with the U.S.'s decision, may agree or disagree with the U.S.'s decision to allow Eastern European countries to join NATO, the rationale for why this was the right thing to do is explained. Individuals representing Eastern Europe, such as Lech Walesa, have their concerns mentioned as well. Ultimately, the West was faced with a dilemma. Do they listen to Russia's concerns or to the concerns of the numerous new heads of Eastern European states? While the West tried for a period of time to consider Russia's concerns first and foremost, this priority died as Boris Yeltsin lost political control and credibility in Russia. As Sarotte describes it, Russia under Gorbachev was against NATO expansion. Yeltsin then was against it too, but Yeltsin, unlike Gorbachev, did not want the issue to strain his relationship with the U.S. He was pressured into agreeing to let Poland join, but then tried to renege his approval. When Yeltsin realized expansion would happen anyway, he insisted that it was okay that NATO expand, but that Russia should be the first country to join. In other words, he wanted to make sure Russia had more protection than other former Soviet states. What the West offered was permanent joint council for Russia in NATO relations, which allowed them to voice their opposition to NATO expansion, as well as any other concerns that they might have. This led to the West assuring Russia that the bulk of NATO's military power would not be placed on countries bordering Russia. Potentially, the relationship NATO had with Russia was supposed to build trust and foster camaraderie between the two powers. According to Lawrence Friedman, there was speculation that this was supposed to lead to Russia joining NATO. That is, the permanent NATO-Russia Joint Council was supposed to lead to them joining NATO. By the end of Yeltsin's term, this not only did not happen, but Yeltsin felt NATO had betrayed Russia by attacking Serbia in the Balkan Wars. This is the story Sarotte tells. Russia and NATO learning to hate each other again. Her book was written in 2021, shortly before the 2022 full-scale Ukrainian invasion. It was written in response to the 2014 Donbass and Crimea invasion. At the time, among those who studied Russia-NATO relations, there was a strong impression that NATO expansion was the cause for Russia's 2014 invasion. However, while Sarotte does a good job explaining the development of the fragile relationship between the West and Russia, I don't think this serves as a thorough explanation for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I say this in regards to both the 2022 invasion and the 2014 invasion. While it is true that Ukraine had talks about joining NATO in 2008, NATO was not a popular proposition in 2008. The Ukrainian President Lukashenko would have had to have held a referendum in order to do so. As it was, NATO only issued a statement with the intention for Ukraine to join. They never issued an actual action plan. Therefore, Ukraine ignored this proposal and remained neutral. The important thing to note is that Ukraine had constitutional neutrality in 2014 when Russia chose to invade. Their politicians were committed to being neutral. It was only on December 2024, after 10 months of war, on December 2014, after 10 months of war, did Ukraine revoke this neutrality. They also didn't officially declare that they wanted to join NATO until as late as February 2018, which was 4 years after being invaded. So Ukraine's bid for NATO membership was a response, not a provocation. One of the rules for joining NATO is that a country's borders cannot be disputed or be actively fought on. As such, no country in Ukraine's condition could ever join NATO. This is true both for Ukraine after 2014 and after 2022. Meanwhile, while the U.S. had reassured its desire for Ukraine to join NATO, Western leaders such as Macron personally assured Putin that they would not let Ukraine join NATO. Given that membership requires unanimous support, this was a guarantee for Russia that Ukraine would not join NATO. Sarotte's book doesn't really tell the story of Ukraine. Rather, her focus is that of NATO expansion. As such, she's good at explaining why Russians felt they got the raw end of the stick. She is also good at explaining why Eastern Europe needed NATO. She expresses why their needs were considered and how they felt undermined by the US's commitment to Russia. While she tells both sides, I agree much more with the Eastern Europeans' perspective than with Russia's. In the 90s, Russia had invaded Moldova, part of Georgia, with peacekeeping troops, Chechnya, and threatened to take land from Ukraine. By all means, Lech Walesa was right to be concerned. While it would have been nice if everyone's security concerns could have been met with the then suggested Partnership for Peace, Russia required serious reform first, before they could be considered not a risk for other former Warsaw countries. While Russia's desire to join NATO would have been strong cooperation with NATO, while it would have been Russia required serious reform first. While Russia desired to join NATO, this would not have guaranteed that Russia would not have respected their neighboring countries' borders, right? So Russia could join NATO, but this would not mean that Russia would now respect other Eastern European countries' borders. So it was better to let other Eastern European countries join first. Quite the contrary, if Russia joined NATO before Georgia, they would have had NATO support as they invaded Georgia in 2008. Think about the conflicts that Turkey gets involved in. This prevents the West, in some cases, from getting involved also because they can't become adversarial to Turkey, because Turkey's in NATO. So this would render a very different, unacceptable moral framework. Needless to say, James Baker's agreement with Gorbachev may have had weight for James Baker. So the other point to consider is that while this agreement between James Baker and Gorbachev may have been a sincere agreement, it was an agreement between James Baker and Gorbachev. It might have applied to George Bush Sr., but it could not have weighed for countries like Poland that were not present for the discussion. How can an agreement in which I'm absent for apply to me? It also couldn't alter the open door policy that NATO had enshrined in its constitution. So NATO had an open door policy. James Baker wasn't able to revoke it. And it couldn't speak for future U.S. presidents. So James Baker spoke for George Bush Sr. and his own administration, but he couldn't speak for Clinton. And just as it was within Trump's right to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, so too was it in Clinton's right to do things differently than his predecessor. This is with every new presidency. As a historian, Sarotte does not herself appear to make such arguments explicitly. Rather, she simply relays the arguments others put forward and relays facts, and one could easily use them for whichever perspective they choose to embrace. The only thing I felt that she was missing, however, were statements made by Russia guaranteeing that they did not see NATO as a threat. For example, considering these quotes, I suppose the distinction is that while Russia did not consider NATO a threat adversary, they did not wish for it to expand. If this be the case, then it should not be noted. So consider the quotes from the 1997. I misspoke there. So consider the quote from the 1997 Russia-NATO founding document that said that Russia does not consider NATO adversarial. They still wish, so if this be the case, then it should be noted that Sarotte's book discussed the controversies surrounding NATO expansion. but she does not discuss the entirety of Russia's relationship to NATO in the West. It's important, in my opinion, to read Sarotte, but not assume that what's described was as significant in the 90s as it is now in the narrative put forward by Russia. More importantly, while it's good to note Russia's grievances, it's also important to realize that this does not directly relate to what they're doing in Ukraine. Russia had other reasons for invading Ukraine that had nothing to do with NATO. You can hear this from himself when he considers Russians and Ukrainians brothers, and you understand the ideology of Ruski Mir ideology, where Russians feel that they can speak for all Rus people. Anyway, this is perhaps a bit sloppy, but I wanted to present this, and this is my reading of Elise Sarotte's Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War. So she's good at describing the relationship between NATO and Russia, but she's not so great at describing why Russia invaded Ukraine, if that's the question somebody has. Because there are reasons that are very pertinent to that situation. Putin in 2002 said he was fine with Ukraine joining NATO because at the time he was under the impression that Ukraine would be under his thumb. So essentially, Russia has always expected Ukraine to be under their thumb since the end of the Belvizia Accords. They've sworn agreements to this in the Belvizia Accords, the 1997 founding document, or not that, but in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, the 2010 Kharkiv Pact. Numerous times they've agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, but actions show that they do not do this. And even before Ukraine ever considered joining NATO, in 2014, Russia made the decision to annex Crimea, so that's important to consider. Anyway, thank you for listening. Just some background information. Hope that helps.